I want to welcome those who are watching the recorded version of this program. I'm honored as leader of the Riverdale Yonkers Society for Ethical Culture to speak about twice a month about how we can live more ethical lives in this complicated world. Religions have been ways that human beings tried to understand life, celebrate and mourn about life, and communicate what they saw as truths and meaning in life. This month saw the religious holidays of Passover and Easter, and we are now in the month of Ramadan. One thing they have in common is that they all involve gathering. Christian churches often have seen the highest attendance of the year on Easter Sunday. Passover means seders, often gatherings with extended family and community. And Ramadan means communal gatherings and doing generous deeds for others. Practitioners of those religions have had to figure out this year alternate ways to find social connection. All three holidays are also in some way about sacrifice, about finding meaning and purpose in giving to others. Leaving home and all that is familiar, wandering to find a new home, celebrated at Passover. Giving up even your life for the sake of others, as celebrated in Easter. And giving to those who are less fortunate is central to Ramadan, and at least once in your life, so is making the sacrifice needed to spend Ramadan in the Holy Land. At the same time, all these holidays are about a kind of liberation. One recognized purpose of giving in Ramadan is to free captives or slaves. In recent years, Muslims in America have used some of their Ramadan gifts to help bail people out of jail or immigrant detention. Passover celebrates leaving a kind of enslavement for freedom. And to the Christian, the sacrifice of Jesus was in the interest of freeing human souls. It is not an accident that the holidays are about both freedom and sacrifice, liberation and responsibility. Two very basic drives of human beings are freedom and interconnection. Freedom is the expression of individuality. We want to be our full and complete selves. We have wants and needs, and one way to look at freedom is the ability of a person to pursue those wants and needs with autonomy, without interference. Interconnection requires a giving up of a part of one's freedom to live together in harmony and peace. We are individuals, and our wants and needs aren't always in alignment. So to live with others, we make some sacrifices of our freedom. We accept responsibility, a voluntary limiting of our own autonomy, to serve sometimes the needs and wants of others, and not just our own. Autonomy and connection are basic tensions of life, and not only as human beings. It's basic biology. The cells that make up life seek individuality, and yet no cell can exist and reproduce without adjusting to its environment. Both independence and dependence are reality. Freedom and responsibility are often in tension, but they are also a system of mutuality. Each helps to create the other. Here it is at its simplest. If I am to have any freedom in society, then that implies that others have a responsibility to allow that freedom. Get out of my way. They have a responsibility not to infringe on my autonomy. As an example, those who advocate for free trade across borders without restrictions or tariffs or quotas, for that to work, they need laws restricting governments from passing such restrictions. Freedom requires restrictions on restrictions. We all go through developmental stages. As infants, we are dependent on others for fulfilling every need: food, liquid, warmth, shelter, touch, cleanliness. As infants develop, especially in a healthy relationship with caregivers, they realize that they have some control over their environment. A cry brings relief of pain or hunger or loneliness. A no gains a little independence. As a child grows, they find ways to meet their own needs. Anyone who's raised an adolescent has likely seen that urge to resist all control and often all responsibility. It's my life. And of course, it's a parent's job to gradually and appropriately release control as a child grows. Sometimes we even let our children make what we know are bad decisions so that they can see what natural consequences look like and make better decisions about bigger matters. Hopefully, we are letting them make small decisions first and providing a safety net when they fall. Parents who keep control over many levels of decisions in their child's life end up with one of two kinds of children. Either ones who strongly reject their family in rebellion, or children who grow to adults who do not know how to make good decisions for themselves. It is a responsibility of adults to see to the liberation of the next generation, so that next generation can also be self-motivated, creative adults. Real liberation doesn't happen unless someone exercised responsibility to help nurture that liberation. Liberation not just from control, but liberation to be able to function effectively without needing someone else to control. Often what looks to an individual like liberation for themselves is actually their ability to exercise control over others. I think we are recognizing more and more that the sad history of this nation, which is not so different from the rest of human history, the urge for liberation and freedom and independence was to escape some kinds of control, but it was also to be able to exercise other kinds of control over other people. Was it really liberation for Jefferson and Washington and Madison in the 18th century to become free from England if these same men were still enslaving other human beings, the most extreme kind of human control? They were still controlling the lives of the women in their families, who could not make basic decisions without male approval. I think we are recognizing more and more that such a liberation is incomplete. It is liberation of some with no responsibility to also see to the liberation of all. But I think we have to ask whether complete freedom without responsibility is even possible. Somewhere in the mind of every adolescent is a search for how to make that possible, and some never grow past that stage. Philosophers have wrestled with the idea. The ancient Greeks, if they talked at all about freedom, were talking often of freedom from being ensnared by base desires and appetites, or of being able to resist the fates set forth by the gods, to not have what we do in life determined outside of ourselves. Philosophers even debate whether we have free will, or whether everything we do is determined by what has already happened up until this moment. The ancient writer Epicurus wrote that when we are self-sufficient, we come to possess the good of freedom. I am amazed at how many seem to think that human self-sufficiency is even possible. That debate broke through into politics when Obama, as a candidate, suggested that businesses weren't self-sufficient and owners didn't, quote, make it all by themselves. Without educated workers, without roads to transport goods and services, without a whole system of food distribution, businesses would not be able to exist. Today's pandemic crisis reveals this even more strongly. We are supposed to shelter at home to try to preserve human life. Maybe not our own, but someone else's. Some resist that as imposing on their liberty. We are dependent on the so-called essential workers, and maybe we've changed our vision of what essential workers really are. Delivery people, nurses and doctors and medical support workers, grocery clerks, people who keep the internet humming so that we can still communicate, the super in your building who keeps surfaces clean so that you might consider going outside even with social distancing, people around the country sewing masks for others when they do not have to. People who make sure that your Social Security check or payroll check still arrive on time. Teachers learning new automated systems so that others can get an education. Many of us are staying home out of a deep sense of social responsibility to create the greatest room for freedom of all in the long run. But not all have the freedom to stay home. The freedom of some to stay safe at home depends on others taking a different kind of responsibility. Complete freedom of each to do whatever they want would be just another kind of violence against others, limiting the decisions then that others can make. When someone decides in this time to go party and then spreads disease to others, they are in fact destroying freedom for others. Liberation of some always involves responsibility of others to respect that freedom or allow it. And the liberation of some always impinges on the liberation of others, and ultimately on our own liberation. If Jefferson and comrades had seen more clearly, and Jefferson did muse something about this in his journals without acting on his musings, they would have seen that freedom to enslave others is ultimately not really freedom. The best example of that I know is the story of George and Martha Washington. George Washington first came to be under the laws of the time an owner of other human beings at the age of 11. When George Washington died, the enslaved people of Mount Vernon numbered 317 people. Under the laws of the time, some of those people had come to Mount Vernon when he married Martha Custis. Those Martha had brought with her in the marriage were under George's control during his lifetime, because married women could not exercise control over what the law considered property. But George could also not legally free those enslaved people until the death of Martha. George Washington had come to question the morality of enslaving people. From the records, it looks like some of that was a squeamishness after the Revolution, as he tried to resolve for himself the contradictions of fighting a war of liberation while still enslaving others. He also realized that there were political consequences of abolitionism. His hope was apparently a grand and gradual abolition. Also, the ways that he had reorganized the business of his estate meant that slavery was becoming less economically viable for him. When Washington died, he liberated many of those he had enslaved. Those he didn't liberate were those who, under the law, were considered part of Martha's property, and the people who were family members of those. George could only specify that these people would be liberated on the death of Martha. Well, Martha outlived her husband by about 3 years. Her health was not great, and for the last part of that time she was confined to a small bedroom at Mount Vernon, completely needing the services of those who were enslaved. And from stories that survive, she was terrified. Those who took care of her knew that when she died, they would be liberated. And she knew that they knew. Her liberation at the expense of others eventually led to her own terror of those others. And writ larger, that is much of the history of 19th century enslavement in America. Stricter and stricter controls were placed on those who were enslaved because of the fear of those who were supposedly free. The more control, the more resistance, and the more resistance, the more controls. When some are not free, no one is truly liberated. And yet many today still don't get that. They march for freedom to put others at risk, limiting the freedom of others. They mistake freedom for license. A more current example of this. One friend wondered recently if the Me Too movement hadn't gone too far. In what way? That now he, had to consider when he joked with women at work how they would take what he said. He thought that was limiting his freedom. What he failed to recognize was that women and some men have long lived with limits to their freedom at work because of behavior of others. Most women have had the experience at work of being briefed by someone, often a woman, about which men to avoid at the office or the shop, because those men are handsy and they don't take no for an answer. The behavior of those people has limited the choice of others for a very long time. A recent statistical study found that in the US, 13% of women and 6% of men have experienced sexual coercion in their lifetime. 27% of women and 12% of men have experienced unwanted sexual contact. And that is also a loss of freedom, which my friend didn't notice because it just seemed how things were. What he noticed was his own change in his sense of his freedom. A different perspective that many more have taken is of responsibility. Watching what you say at work is a voluntary limiting of your freedom so that others are also free. And there's a liberation even in that. My friend did finally figure that out. Acting towards women as if they are mere objects limits one's own ability to have deeper and more authentic relationships. And an authentic relationship liberates you as well. When you act towards another person recognizing their personhood, including their need to be autonomous and have the ability to consent or not, you are going to be more liberated too. Freedom that doesn't recognize the freedom of others is not really freedom. It is license or privilege, entitlement, presumption. All freedom comes to some extent at the expense of freedom. All liberation comes at the expense of some liberation. Liberation of those who have not yet been liberated means others lose a bit of the autonomy they had. But that can be seen as responsibility, not just a loss of freedom, to enable the liberation of others. And yet, liberation and freedom are still valuable goals. We need to find ways to liberate that expand who is liberated and how. Now, my family when I was growing up was a pretty typical 1950s working class family in many ways. Mom worked through her 20s in World War II, then eagerly took on the role of motherhood. Dad worked outside the home in a craftsman job. After one family incident, described by my mother in a letter to her sister, a cousin decided to immortalize us in wood. He was a talented wood carver. So I invite you to picture 4 small wooden figures. Baby brother in a diaper, crawling, with a small hammer raised up in one hand, looking quite aggressive and pleased with himself. Newfound freedom to do what he wanted. And then there's 4-year-old Jone, crying, with her toy piano in one hand, several of the keys missing. And there's Mother, in her very 1950s flowered dress, bending over, obviously yelling at us. And Dad at his workbench in another world, free of worry about the family drama. That was the world before women's liberation came along. My mother was a beneficiary of 1960s feminism, although a skeptic of it. She went back to work when her kids grew up, and she finished up her college degree at age 60, sadly to die the same year from cancer. And my dad, he became an ardent supporter of feminism after Mom died. I don't think he was ever fond of his 1950s so-called freedom from the family. It involved a mandate to go to work and a measurement of his worth by his earnings. He valued the ways that men and women under feminism could develop their fuller personalities when we weren't stuck in predetermined sex roles. Mom frustrated at work, Dad frustrated at his workbench, both free to do what they wanted, but not really free. Duty and responsibilities are words that we often don't want to hear. Liberation and freedom seem a lot more fun. Yet without people dutifully supporting the freedom of others and their own, nobody would have freedom. In a time in the 19th century when many were finding liberation from religious tradition, a young man, Felix Adler, created the institution we are part of, ethical culture. On the one hand, it was a liberating institution. Traditional beliefs no longer made sense. We did not have a duty to continue pretending to believe them. In fact, Adler would have said we had a duty to truth to not pretend. With a generation before him teaching that self-culture or self-directed education and growth was the highest value, Adler chose to found something he called a Society for Ethical Culture. He even called it, in his first published collection of essays, a religion of duty, and yet one which many have found in a quest to liberate themselves from religions that don't work for them. Ethics recognizes the need to treat others as individuals, as full, worthy selves deserving of liberation, and the responsibility, even duty, to act in ways that free others. And as Felix Adler recognized in founding a Society for Ethical Culture, often it is in acting in ways that create the most freedom for others that we in fact create the most freedom for ourselves. Liberation of some at the expense of others is not liberation. The wider the liberation, the more meaningful it is for all. Consider then today how authentic liberation and responsibility need to work together, not only to get through the rest of this time of shutdown, but to put back the pieces of culture and economy to move forward. And maybe not to put them back, maybe to create something new, to deal with the realities as well of how interdependent we are with the environment and a climate that sustains the kind of life which can free most of us, not that is just survivable by a few. What measures liberate the most? What responsibilities do we now realize we have towards one another? How can each of us exercise responsibility for this moment and for what we need to face together over the next few years? I'm going to close with a short reading from Bishop Desmond Tutu. I started out talking about some of the religious holidays, so this reading uses one of those stories as a metaphor. It may be a few weeks after Passover now, but I think we are familiar with the narrative. It fits in many ways, I think, with what we face in this day. Bishop Tutu wrote, "Liberation is costly. Even after the Lord had delivered the Israelites from Egypt, they had to travel through the desert. They had to bear the responsibilities and difficulties of freedom. There was starvation and thirst, and they kept complaining. Many of them preferred the days of bondage. We must remember that liberation is costly. It needs unity. We must hold hands and refuse to be divided. We must be ready. Some of us will not see the day of our liberation physically, but those people will have contributed to the struggle. Let us be united. Let us be filled with hope. Let us be those who respect one another." So I'll say goodbye now to those watching the recorded version of this video. You can find more videos from us and more about us at RYSEC.org, RYSEC.org, or at our Facebook page for the Riverdale Yonker Society for Ethical Culture. Come join us some Sunday morning.